Is this the biggest national asset grab of the century? No tanks, no airstrikes, just a signature and a bank account. January 3rd, 2026, U.S. forces land in Caracas and detain Maduro. At the same time, over 60 oil tankers linked to Venezuela vanish under court-ordered seizure, billions in crude rerouted. Then came the real twist. The U.S. announced it would sell 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil on the open market, and the money frozen in American-controlled accounts for safekeeping. Officially, this was about restoring democracy. But behind the PR? This was a play to protect the petrodollar, because when Venezuela started selling oil for yuan and euros, it didn't just break sanctions, it challenged the system. The same system that's been in place since 1973, where nearly all oil trades flow through US dollars. The result? If you don't sell oil in dollars, you don't sell oil. So how did the US pull this off without firing a shot? Simple. They didn't seize oil fields. They seized paperwork. In this video, we'll break down the entire operation. How financial tools replaced military invasions, how U.S. traders are flipping seized oil for profit, and why this blueprint could hit the next target fast. Because here's the truth, the next war for oil won't be over barrels, it'll be over bank access. Follow the money. To understand how we got here, you've got to start with two things. One, Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves. Roughly 300 billion barrels. That's more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran. And two, it's been locked out of the global financial system for nearly a decade. Since 2017, U.S. sanctions cut off Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, from dollar clearing systems. Banks wouldn't touch its money. Tankers wouldn't dock. The country's oil output collapsed from 2.3 million barrels a day to under 400,000. In response, Maduro turned east. He started selling oil to China and India, sometimes for yuan, sometimes through barter. He leaned on ghost fleets and traceable tankers that turned off GPS, changed flags mid-sea, and delivered crude through legal gray zones, and it worked kind of. Between 2021 and 2025, Venezuela moved an estimated 150 million barrels through shadow routes. Not massive, but enough to draw attention in D.C. because this wasn't just about oil, it was about control. Since the 1970s, the U.S. has enforced an unwritten rule. If you want to sell oil at scale, you settle in dollars. That system, the petrodollar, gave Washington leverage no one else had. Not just over oil, but over central banks, trade balances, and even foreign policy. So when Venezuela started bypassing that system, it wasn't just defiance, it was provocation. That's why the raid in 2026 wasn't a random flex, it was a message. Not just to Caracas, but to Beijing, to Moscow, to anyone thinking of selling oil outside the system. Sound familiar? Next, I'll show you how the U.S. pulled it off without a war. Just courts, contracts, and control. They called it Operation Southern Spear. But this wasn't a military campaign in the traditional sense. No ground troops storming oil fields, no bombers over pipelines. This was a financial raid, wrapped in legal paperwork. The operation started with maritime seizures. Beginning in December 2025, the U.S. Coast Guard, with support from allied navies, began intercepting tankers suspected of carrying Venezuelan crude. Some of these ships were flagged under Liberia or Panama. Others were part of Venezuela's shadow fleet ships that routinely disabled transponders, spoofed locations, and offloaded oil ship to hide origins. By early January, over 60 tankers had been impounded or turned away. One even flew a Russian flag, adding fuel to already tense geopolitics. Then came the trigger. On January 3rd, under a sealed indictment, U.S. federal agents coordinated with regional allies to detain Maduro. Official charges? Drug trafficking, terror financing, human rights violations. But the real impact wasn't legal, it was economic. Because with Maduro in custody and his inner circle fractured, Washington had what it needed: an opening to restructure control over Venezuelan oil. That same week, the U.S. Department of Justice filed emergency asset forfeiture motions. The claim? That oil being sold through illegal channels was tied to criminal enterprises and could be lawfully seized under existing sanctions law. It wasn't just about stopping bad actors. It was about redirecting flow from black market tankers to U.S.-approved channels. That's when the money started moving. Once the oil was seized, the next move was pure financial engineering. The U.S. didn't just hold on to the crude, they sold it, openly, legally, through American brokers, under American law, priced in American dollars. 50 million barrels were auctioned off in the first wave, and the revenue? Locked in U.S.-controlled escrow accounts held at banks in Delaware and New York. The justification? This money belongs to the people of Venezuela, but those people had zero access to it. Because here's the catch: the funds could only be released under new governance structures approved by the U.S. Treasury, which meant Washington now had de facto veto power over every dollar of Venezuela's oil revenue. That's the trap. If you sell oil through the dollar system, the U.S. can track, freeze, and redirect the money instantly. If you try to go around the system, they'll hit you with sanctions, asset seizures, and legal chokeholds. It's not just about punishing enemies. It's about preserving the petrodollar default, the idea that all major oil flows should touch the U.S. banking system at some point. That's how a currency becomes global infrastructure. It's not just a medium of exchange, it's a compliance tool, and Venezuela just triggered the auto response. You seeing this? It's not about oil barrels, it's about payment rails. So who's making money from this? Not Venezuela, not the families waiting on food shipments or hospital supplies, not the oil workers who haven't seen a paycheck in months, but U.S. traders, refiners, middlemen. They're feasting. Firms like Vital, Trafigura, and Glencore, already seasoned in sanctioned markets, were first in line. They scooped up Venezuelan crude at steep discounts, often 30–40% below market rate. Why? Because seized oil comes with political baggage. Not every buyer wants to touch it, but American refiners on the Gulf Coast, they're set up for heavy crude, and Venezuelan oil is perfect feedstock. So the crude gets offloaded in Louisiana or Texas, turned into diesel, jet fuel, asphalt, then resold at global prices. The spread between what they paid and what they earned? Massive. One analyst called it the most profitable arbitrage in recent memory. And who clears the payments? American banks. Which means they earn on fees, currency conversions, and interest while the money sits in temporary holding. Meanwhile, Venezuelan hospitals run out of medicine, food prices triple, and no one can access the dollars that technically still belong to the country. All of this legal. That's the brilliance of the model. It doesn't take resources by force, it buys them under duress. Then locks the profits in systems only it can open. Sound fair? Didn't think so. Here's the part that really flips the script. None of this was classified. None of it required new laws. It all happened in public view inside the legal architecture the U.S. built over decades. Let's break it down. Step 1. Declare the Maduro regime illegitimate. That opened the door for recognizing a transitional authority even if it didn't control the country. Step 2. Freeze state assets held abroad, especially oil revenues, under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act (EPA). The U.S. President can block any transaction deemed a threat to national security. Step 3. File civil forfeiture claims, not criminal, civil. That means the U.S. doesn't have to convict anyone to seize assets, just prove probable cause. Step 4. Redirect seized revenues to authorized custodians. In Venezuela's case, that meant a hand-picked council of opposition figures backed, of course, by Washington, legally. Rock solid, morally? That's another story. Russia called the seizures theft. China said it was economic colonialism. Even some U.S. allies raised eyebrows, but no one stopped it, because the paperwork was airtight. And this is what makes the mechanism so dangerous. It looks like justice. It sounds like diplomacy. But underneath? It's a global resource transfer model optimized for 21st century finance. You don't need troops when you've got treasury lawyers. You don't need invasions when you control the exit ramps of global trade, and you definitely don't need regime change. If you already hold the keys to the vault, the dust hadn't even settled before the backlash began. Russia's foreign ministry slammed the operation as economic piracy, demanding the return of its co-owned oil shipments and threatening to reroute exports through ruble-only contracts. China was more subtle, calling the raid an unfortunate overreach and warning that financial warfare undermines global trade stability. Translation: don't try this with our supply chains. At the UN, a bloc of Latin American and African nations called for an inquiry, but the resolution died in committee, because once again the legal framing held oil markets shaken but not broken. WTI prices dipped briefly on news that 50 million new barrels were entering the system. But traders quickly realized this wasn't a flood of new supply, it was controlled redistribution. In fact, the U.S. set quotas for where the oil could go, prioritizing allies in Europe and refiners in the Gulf, and because it was routed through American banks, every dollar flowed back through the system. Venezuela's new interim leadership, under U.S. guidance, tried to play along. They issued statements of cooperation, held press events, welcomed foreign investment. But on the streets of Caracas, nothing changed. Power outages continued. Water rationing got worse. Food prices soared as inflation crushed the. For the average Venezuelan, the raid didn't feel like rescue. It felt like rebranding an old system in a new suit. The oil moved, the money moved, but the people? Still stuck, and globally, something else shifted. Countries started asking, if Venezuela's reserves could be seized this cleanly, whose turn is next? As of mid-2026, Venezuela is technically pumping again. Production has climbed back to around 850,000 barrels per day, nearly double the low point from a few years ago. But here's the catch. Almost none of that oil is under Venezuelan control. Every barrel is sold through a U.S.-approved mechanism. Buyers must clear payments through designated banks, and all revenue goes into escrow accounts managed not by Caracas, but by financial trustees in Delaware, the official line. We're safeguarding Venezuela's wealth until democratic institutions can responsibly manage it in practice. It's a custody battle with no end date. Foreign companies are lining up for drilling rights, Chevron, Halliburton, even European firms frozen out of Russian energy. But they're not negotiating with Venezuelan ministries. They're negotiating with U.S.-vetted intermediaries, and back home, there's no budget increase, no infrastructure boom. Just austerity, IMF advisors, and vague promises of reform. The new transitional government praised abroad, tolerated at home walks a tightrope. They've stabilized currency for now, but only because dollars are drip-fed through controlled pipelines. Meanwhile, inflation still bites, unemployment remains brutal, and public trust barely exists. So yes, the oil's flowing again. Yes, investors are watching closely. But for most Venezuelans, it's clear. Their resources may have returned to market, but not to them and the world. It's watching how easy it was to pull this off. Because if this is the new model for restoring democracy, it looks a lot like the old model for extracting value. Zoom out, and what you're seeing isn't just a Venezuela story. It's a blueprint. This was Petrodollar Enforcement 2.0, a cleaner, quieter way to keep global oil flows inside the dollar system. No boots on the ground, no regime change invasions, just legal frameworks, banking dominance, and maritime leverage. Here's how it works. Step 1. Identify a country drifting from the dollar selling oil in yuan, rubles, or barter. Step 2. Apply sanctions. Restrict access to financial plumbing like SWIFT, clearinghouses, or port insurance. Step 3. Use civil asset forfeiture to seize oil, tankers, or revenue streams. Step 4. Rebrand the operation as humanitarian. Step 5. Route the money through U.S.-controlled accounts, then redistribute. Simple, repeatable, profitable. Why does it work? 3 reasons. First, dollar dominance. The greenback still accounts for over 80% of global oil transactions. That gives the U.S. home field advantage in nearly every deal. Second, banking chokeholds. Most oil trades require letters of credit, wire transfers, and insurance, all of which pass through Western systems. Third, legal framing. By labeling operations as counter-narcotics or anti-corruption, Washington avoids the optics of empire and wraps seizures in legitimacy. This isn't conspiracy, it's strategy. And if you're sitting on oil reserves right now outside the petrodollar zone, you're on the list. Venezuela was just proof of concept. Let me ask you, was this justice? Or a legalized resource grab? Because when you strip away the headlines, the indictments, the speeches, this wasn't just a crackdown. It was a controlled transfer of power from a country drowning in inflation to a system built to extract value with zero bullets fired. Drop a comment below. Do you think this was about helping Venezuela or about reminding the world who controls the exit routes? Because this wasn't just a one-off. It was a playbook, a dry run, a template, and now that it's worked, you better believe it'll get reused. In fact, it already is. Next week, we're going to Africa, where China's building billion-dollar oil and gas deals from Angola to Congo, where Russia's Rosneft is signing 30-year contracts in Mali and the Central African Republic, and guess who's not invited? The U.S. isn't watching that quietly. Because if the petrodollar is threatened in Africa the way it was in Venezuela, the playbook comes out again. Sanctions, seizures, shadow deals, different continent, same strategy. So if you learned something today, share this video, not for hype, for awareness. Because no matter where you live, if you've got a pension, a 401,000, or oil in your economy, you're tied to this system. Check the video description for verified sources, court documents, tanker seizures, White House memos, and offshore payment data. And remember, follow the money.